Hello, I'm Micheline Sheehy Skeffington. I'm president of the BSBI, and I lectured for over 30 years in plant ecology at the University of Galway. And I'm going to talk today about Ireland's Lusitanian Flora, one of which is in the foreground in this painting by famous painter Harry Kernoff, and he painted it near Killarney, which is in fact the headquarters for Arbutus unado. You may recognize it there. However, I want to talk first about my predecessor, Professor David Webb. He was the very first Irish president, and indeed I'm the second from the Republic of Ireland. And he was a giant in botany, and when he first started in Trinity College, he produced an Irish flora, which was the very first flora which had keys to identify species, right down to species, all the flora. And of course, there were many iterations of these right down through the years. And the very final one, which was written or re-edited by John Parnell and Tom Curtis, was published after his death. But he was actually a giant in botany, and he was much more conversant with flora outside Ireland as well as in Ireland, because he was one of the editors of Flora Europaea. And he really enjoyed traveling right across the continent to all the countries involved in Flora Europaea. I gather he spoke 15 languages. He was conversant anyway, read them, certainly fluent in French and German. And he also enjoyed the culinary delights of each of the countries. So he was very much enjoyed his travels abroad, and was a very scholarly botanist. His main interests, in fact, were saxifrages, which he produced here, a book on them with Robert Gornall. And that took him to far corners of mountains in strange parts of Europe, if you like. He was better known about campus and indeed in town in his signature denim outfit, which he also wore obviously out in the field. So I want to talk about one of his interests here, which was the special nature of the Irish flora. We're very proud of species that occur in Ireland that don't occur in Britain. So these are the angiosperms, the flowering plants that we have that do not occur in Britain, if you accept the Neotinia maculata, which he had some query about, and the nearest place otherwise is near Santander in North Spain. So the bottom four are a bit separate. The last two have the nearest station in Newfoundland, but also Arenaria ciliata and Euphrasia salzburgensis. Their nearest stations are in the Vosges and Jura, so the eastern France have a more easterly distribution. And indeed, if you look at the other species, you'll find that two of them are on the cover of the very first edition of an Irish flora. This is Saxifraga hirsuta on the left and Dabicia cantabrica on the right. The Ericaceae, of course, occurs in Scotland. So if we discount the last four, then these species have, almost all of them, have their nearest station or their main station in Spain, in the Iberian Peninsula. So we can call these Ireland's Lusitanian flora and species. Now, I want to take a quote from a publication, a paper David Webb wrote in Watsonia, and it was about the native status of plants. There is a curious emotional bias, which I've found very widespread, and from which I may not be entirely free myself, which favours native status for an attractive plant or for the botanist's home county. Now, in this case, I think we might substitute the word country for county, and we'll see how this fares in this bias or otherwise. So now in this talk, I haven't got time to deal with all of them, and I'm really only going to talk about the Ericaceae and mainly focus on Arbutus and Erica maciana. So starting with Arbutus, here called Arbousier d'Irlande, which I think is strange for a Frenchman to call it Irish Arbutus, since it occurs quite widespread in the south of France. And let's look at the distribution. This is the BSBI database, which of course is invaluable for studying species. And its distribution in these islands is considered native only in these areas, in these hectads. And first of all, you notice that it's quite an odd distribution for a native species. It grows on cliffs, in lakes, on islands in lakes, and there's plenty of those in the intervening area. But this is a disjunct distribution, the big gap here. And indeed, Robert Lloyd Prager explored a lot of the lakes in the intervening area, looking on the islands, looking on the shores, and he never found arbutus. It isn't known to occur in any of those places. So that's slightly odd for a species that isn't confined to a particular unique habitat. If we look at its distribution in Europe, we see that it has a very essentially Mediterranean distribution. It's fairly widespread on the Iberian Peninsula and then occurs up the west coast of France. And then again, you find the two Irish stations are quite a long way from the nearest place of where it's considered native, at least 400 kilometers away. So again, here you have a disjunct distribution. And the question is, how did it get to Ireland? It's an absolute given that it did not survive the Ice Age. It's a Mediterranean tree or small shrub, which structurally wouldn't have survived. It doesn't survive in very cold climates. And we know now that Ireland was entirely covered by ice over the last Ice Age. So it must have come back after the Ice Age. And how did it manage to get to Ireland by leapfrogging across some 400 kilometers from its nearest native place? So this was one of the things that intrigued me. But let's have a look a little bit at its distribution in the region where it's most widespread, because that looks like it's quite common in this region. But actually, if you look at the detailed map here, we used all the records in the database, the DDB. We looked up all the old literature, which is often the pre-1950 records. And we also did extensive field work. And you'll see that there are really quite clustered sites where you've got arbutus, and some of them are really quite small. Killarney here is by far the greatest population. Over 80% of the entire population of Ireland is here around Killarney. There's perhaps 200 in Glengariff, and then much smaller amounts in these other clusters. This one here is Park Nasilla. We don't include it because we suspect that these were planted. It's an estate, big estate area, and the people who owned it were actually from Killarney. And then these are isolated plants, trees here, which may well have been planted or escaped from nearby gardens. So these are the main headquarters. And as you can see, very localized in a landscape which has plenty of lakes and cliffs in this old red sandstone landscape. And yet it's very much confined to these regions here. So how could arbutus have come to Ireland, and from where? This is a question, obviously, that we wonder, but there is a lot of evidence for it being there for thousands of years. Elizabeth Vokes, in a pollen study, took some cores above this lake, Upper Loch Lane, or the Upper Lake at Killarney, and she found it in the pollen core, and the oldest record that she found for it was around 4,000 years ago. So that kind of marks it as being here for thousands of years. Perhaps more conclusive because it was more abundant. And Pauline van Reen did some work on an excavation of a Bronze Age copper mine at Ross Island in Loch Lean, which is to the north of this upper lake that you see in the picture. And she dated the different layers, and then the layer that's dated starting about 4,200 years ago, arbutus was comprised of up to 3% of the total charcoal at the site. So that's very significant. Now, these are both very old records, so this resulted in people assuming, well, it's been there for thousands of years, it must be native. However, this paper by Santiso et al. Was sent to us by Jaime Fagundes, who's our friend who lives in Galicia, and these are colleagues of his from another university. They sampled arbutus, as you can see, right throughout its distribution, and they found that it had the chloroplast DNA had two different distinct lineages, the H2 derived, and the H4. And if you look closely, there is a line here, and west of that line, there is only the H2 derived, or H2 and H2 derived type genetic DNA lineage. And that's interesting because the Pyrenees would have cut the Iberian Peninsula off during the Ice Age. But the other interesting thing is the Irish population is also colored red. It's H2 derived, but it doesn't have any of the H4, which you would have expected had it migrated north either from France or from Spain across to Ireland. You would expect it to have picked up some of the genetic signature of the French populations. So in addition, it looks like the genetic makeup is most similar to the population sampled near Santander. So this is very intriguing and shows that maybe it didn't even come from France, but it came directly from some part of North Spain, possibly near Santander. So let's have a look here at the, I'm going to move this. Have a look at the actual site. Ross Island, where Pauline van Rijn did her excavation, was here. This is a copper mine, and it actually is the very first Bronze Age copper mine to have been exploited in Northwest Europe. So this is the first sighting of it. There are a couple of other mines in the area, but the very first one was started 4,400 years ago. And this is it here. The BSBI annual summer meeting visited it and heard about the history of the mine and indeed the connection with the arbutus. It's quite a spectacular mine, in fact. So now let's have a look at the distribution of the species again, and we have a look again here at all the known Bronze Age copper mines in Ireland. And that is extraordinarily similar to the distribution of arbutus in southwest Ireland. This point here is Killarney with the Ross Island site 4,400 years ago. All of these other mines are more recent. They're maybe 4,000 years old down to 3,500 and so on here. So that distribution on the face of it seems to be very much associated with the Bronze Age copper mines. If you go back to our distribution map, we mapped the Bronze Age mines on top and superimposed them on our distribution here without the circles. Clearly, Killarney had several around Lough Lane, but also notice that wherever there's a cluster of arbutus, there is a copper mine associated with it in this region. These ones here, a lot of them are on the mountains, on the hillside, so there were people in the valleys and in the valley on the other side of the hill. Remember, these are some of the isolated plants, and the only large enough cluster of them is in the Clooney Lakes, Lusitanian. And I say to the archaeologists, perhaps you should go and find the mine, because it seems to have a very close association with mining, including down here, Crookhaven. This is the second oldest mine in Ireland. So what is this association? How might it have come? And it was certainly valued for its charcoal, but it would not have been established for that. It took 200 years for it to become established. So just to have a look at the mining, the Ross Island mine, the first one, the Chalcolithic, is actually the Copper Age before they discovered bronze. And the British sites, the first ones were in Wales, but these were not active at the time of the opening up of the Ross Island mine. It was 300 years later before the first one started there. So the nearest mine to the Ross Island site, in fact, was a cluster of mines, the Chalcolithic mines, which date back to 4,600 years, and they were still active at the time of the starting up of the Ross Island. So is it possible that people came from northern Spain to Ross Island to exploit the copper? And did they bring the arbutus with them from somewhere in North Spain? It appears maybe near Santander, maybe near these mines. My thought is that they possibly brought it as alcohol, because it ferments really easily on the trees in Portugal and in hotter parts of the Iberian Peninsula, and that it was a ready source of alcohol, came for that and then perhaps got discarded, and it spreads very easily with opening up of woodlands for mining, coppicing, or any other kind of clearance, and maybe that facilitated it to spread towards the southwest. We don't know exactly, but we are conducting some further, more detailed genetic studies to learn a bit more about the history and connections between the Irish populations of arbutus. So now I want to go on to perhaps an even more intriguing species, a Lusitanian species, which has fascinated me since the 80s when I had my first PhD student, Lieveke van Dorselaar. You can see, first of all, that its main distribution outside Ireland is, its only distribution is in northern Spain. And that's very unusual, except remember that the speciation of heathers occurred here during the various ice ages, and this one is definitely a species. But it is confined to northern Spain, Galicia, Asturias, and Cantabrica. And then it has 6 isolated occurrences in Ireland. And there's a huge distance now between the nearest population outside Ireland and these 6 sites. So that's quite extraordinary. How did it get to Ireland, and how did it bypass all the intervening areas? So now, if you look at it in Ireland, the first thing that is odd is it doesn't set seed. So in other words, it hasn't spread very far from where it first came. It reproduces by turf cutting and disturbance around lake shores, but it doesn't spread by seed. Pollen can hybridize with the Erica tetralix, which of course crossleaf teeth is very abundant across Ireland, and anywhere where Machiana occurs, there's always quite a lot of hybrids between the two. And that isn't a given, but it is often an indication that the 2 species did not evolve close to each other, because otherwise they might have developed mechanisms not to hybridize. And indeed, in Spain, they rarely do co-occur. And I just want to draw your attention to this quote by David Webb, which I find interesting. In his Watsonia paper, he says, "It seems reasonable to assume that most native plants are capable of reproducing, at least in part, by seed, and that if a plant reproduces entirely vegetatively, it can legitimately be suspected of being an alien. There are, of course, some exceptions. Plants of extremely local relic distribution, Erica machiana, and so on." Now, this seems to be an example of the emotional bias that he refers to in the previous paragraphs of that paper. That's my emphasis in this quote, but it is odd that Machiana is such an attractive plant, very intriguing, and basically all the botanists of Webb's time and before that could not see any reason why it was not native. It occurred in very out-of-the-way places. However, that's a clue, I think, to how it might have come to Ireland. As I say, it's in remote areas. It's not anywhere near any of the main ports, and this means that it came by a small transport of people. If you look at, and I'm assuming it's coming by human transport, but let's have a look at the 6 sites. The Donegal site is on what might pass as a main road here, but it's quite a narrow road, comes in, and about 7 or 8 kilometers inland, it suddenly occurs around this lake, Loch Nacoon. In Mayo, the main site is here. It's about 10 kilometers, and it is up a track, along a track, off a track, and it is the first perhaps area where it reaches the mountains, somewhere where you can perhaps hide it. And it's known that if people smuggle goods, they often brought them inland for about 10 kilometers, and then they dumped them and perhaps repackaged them so that they would not look like smuggled goods. The same here in Kerry. The O'Connell family that lived in this area is famous for its smuggling. Indeed, if you look at my paper on the Kerry Lily, it explains a bit about that. And one of the tracks that leads up to this little road is known as the Smuggler's Path. So again, about 10 kilometers inland, suddenly it's in this very small area. Another site at Carna, and then the Roundstone bog one, it's much more widespread. And in fact, this is the distribution of the hybrid as well as the species. But it doesn't have quite the same pattern as these. And I'll come back to that. But to me, it seems that these hidden spots shows that it was brought, I think, convincingly by people to have arrived in these spots. They land perhaps from one particular seed, therefore it's not self-compatible, and it just reproduces vegetatively over time in these areas, in these hidden corners of Ireland, where in fact, as you know, there's tons of bog where it could grow normally. And the other thing is in northern Spain, in Galicia here, this is a couple collecting this as bedding, because animals are brought in at night, and heathland and bracken and heathers and things are collected regularly for animal bedding. And it is known also that it was for packaging, for packing goods, and therefore packing goods in ships. And perhaps if you had valuable breakable things like bottles that you were smuggling, you might well have recourse to this kind of the readily supplied growth in the northern Spain. And in fact, if you look into this, we had a very quick look at what was in the haystack, and we found 2 species, one of which, Dabicia cantabrica, of course, occurs also in Ireland. So this is quite an intriguing use of heathers, which may well explain why and how they came to Ireland. Now, finally, there's just this really interesting study by our friend Jaime Fagundes, and I sampled the specimens in Ireland, and he sampled in Spain 2 sites, Loba Xistral in Galicia, and 4 sites in Asturias. And these ones are blue, which you can see here in the tree, the genetic tree, and the mauve purple ones are the Asturias ones here. And they're all kind of derived from Asturias, and then the Galician ones. But the really interesting thing is to see where do the Irish populations fit. And they don't occur all together. Each one fits in with a slightly different connection. The Mayo ones are connected with the Asturias populations. Carna and Kerry and Donegal are connected perhaps with slightly different populations, but all in and around Galicia. And then the Roundstone one is slightly connected to Galicia, but seems to be rather different and out on its own. And in fact, Jaime wasn't sure if he'd sampled perhaps the population from which it derived. There's an interesting thing about that. But the real thing is that not only do we think that it was brought by smugglers to Ireland, but that it was brought time and again from different parts of northern Spain as people came in to Ireland. I also want to talk about Erica erigena just briefly, known as the Irish heath or the Mediterranean heath, grows on shores, but it's mainly confined to Mayo. There's a population here on Ericaceae and a small cluster of plants here, but mostly it's in Mayo. Now, for a plant that has migrated north from Spain, because that's where its headquarters is, or even indeed France, it seems very odd that it would bypass all the coastline and heathland areas in between. Now, this is from Peter Foss's work here, who did some work. We've adapted it and plotted it again using the DDB as well. And you can see it is very much a coastal. It's associated with streams and disturbance around lake shores here. And here it seemed to be the most abundant. This is where the photo's taken. And Peter Foss took 2 cores in this area to see how old or how far down in the depth of the core the species would be found. It took some time to identify 2 species because Ericaceous pollen is very difficult to identify the species, but he used electron scanning microscopy, and he found that it never occurred any older than about 1450, so AD. It just wasn't in the pollen core before that. So he reckoned it had come in with people again, and he thought perhaps that they had come as pilgrims from Galicia, because the Irish were already sailing back and forth to Galicia, to Santiago de Compostela, and perhaps they brought it back again as packaging with some goods that they brought. It also occurs near Bordeaux and Bilbao and in Portugal. So it could have come from other places as well, maybe also people bringing back packaging, but this predates smuggling. It's older in occurrence than the smuggling. And also notice that on the continent, it's associated with the main seafaring ports. In Ireland, it is not. So they would have come there, and then people were living all around the west coast of Ireland, and they just brought it and left it around on the shore as they unloaded their boats, or unloaded boats off boats, more likely. So that seems to be a plausible story to say that, again, Erica erigena, the Mediterranean heath or Irish heath, it's not really that Mediterranean, has come with people and probably as part of packaging. Now, the final one is perhaps the most attractive plant, the Dabicia in Daviox heath. And it's associated, its iconic signature species for South Connemara. And a bit like Erica erigena, it occurs only really in and around Connemara, and it's very widespread there, and also in South Mayo, but nowhere else in the intervening area. And yet it occurs in heathland, it occurs on the edges of bogs and on dry, rockier parts around the bog, and there's plenty of that in all the intervening areas, as well as, of course, in Donegal. So I don't know about that, but I think it's quite strange that the species came of its own accord and bypassed the intervening areas. So I want to just end really by these two species here growing together in Asturias. To remind you that the Connemara site for Erica machiana is very much more widespread, and we suspect that it has actually been brought by a different means, probably much predating the smuggling times. As we've seen, the Erica erigena came in the 15th century, but it could even have come much earlier. The arbutus is here in over 4,000 years. So that's an intriguing thing. The distribution doesn't quite fit with the theory that it's been hidden, and yet there are lots of little ways in which you can come in by ship and boat, and perhaps it was left there during a previous time. And maybe the palynologist should take some course and see can they date it back like Peter Foss did. And then finally, the distribution using tetrads, which shows they're often more recent records because we recorded, things were recorded more on a hectad level before that. You can see here that it's all widespread right through Connemara, and it appears to be spreading into Mayo. There's certainly some areas where it is relatively recent, including around here and on Achill. So for some reason, Killary Harbour and the mountains prevented it spreading over time. Further east, obviously, you've got limestone. So it's been confined to Connemara and has become widespread. It obviously sets seed, so it's able to spread quite well, but it hasn't really spread anywhere else except in the southern parts of Mayo. So I suspect that it has been there perhaps for thousands of years, brought in some way by some method or other by human beings, I would think, and that it has landed maybe once, maybe several times in Connemara, but never really anywhere else in Ireland. So that is another Lusitanian plant, which has perhaps a question mark over how it came. One of the studies by Gemma Beattie and Jim Provan showed that it had actually quite a uniform haplotype for a lot of the genes that they studied in the DNA, except for one, and they were not quite sure where it would have come from, but didn't fully explain that maybe human beings brought it. But it's interesting, nobody's done the genetics on it since then to have a look at more detail. So that's just a detailed zoom in of that, much more visible. And so just to summarize in conclusion, arbutus quite probably first came to Ireland about 4,400 years ago with the first copper miners in northwest Europe from northern Spain, we fairly sure. Erica machiana and Erica erigena occur in disturbed parts of bogs and appear to be still spreading, but machiana very slowly because it doesn't set seed, and in very localized spots. It's not all over Ireland by any means, or even in the counties where they occur. And they came perhaps 200 years ago from machiana to 600 years ago as packing for goods, except perhaps at Roundstone. Maybe it was packing, but it certainly came much older, at an older time. And then Dabisha, which looks native and occurs throughout Connemara, is not in Kerry or in Donegal, and is only recently spreading northwards into Mayo and into northwest Mayo. So perhaps it came thousands of years ago, but I suspect by human transport. So that's a brief history, if you like, of the Lusitanian species in Ireland. And I thank you for listening. It's my partner, Nick, with myself, with a very large arbutus specimen at Glengarriff. And I just want to finish there, except I just have one more thing to say. I'm selling at the conference, selling this book, which is my latest, well, my only book, apart from the Flora, on a gender equality case, which I won against my university. And there was a 4-year campaign, and Rose Foley has written this up, and it's a great read about how you can be successful and how you can take on the establishment. You can get it in all bookshops. You can ask if they haven't got it on display, and you can get it online at Micheline's 3conditions.wordpress.com. So perhaps something you might like to get for a book club or even Christmas present. Thanks very much indeed for listening.